When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, it stole for itself an asset that Vladimir Putin later believed that he would be able to use in his full invasion of Ukraine 8 years later. And for a while, Putin was right. He loaded Crimea with so much military equipment, along with the Black Sea Fleet, that the peninsula was a clear threat to Ukraine. But Ukraine has been chipping away at that threat. Now Crimea is less an asset and more of a disastrous liability for Putin. It's becoming increasingly clear that Russia is struggling to defend the annexed territory from which it thought it would be launching a huge number of its attacks. Ukraine has just landed a devastating blow in Crimea at a base that it struck only a couple of days before, and Russia has suffered notable losses there. On December 20th, Defense Blog reported that the Security Service of Ukraine, or SBU, had launched a second strike against the Belbek airbase in Crimea in the span of just a handful of days. The first of those attacks destroyed key air defense systems at the base, including some radar systems Russia needed to direct the fire of its S-400s and fighter jets. Now, with a safe aerial pathway seemingly secured, Ukraine seems to have decided that hitting Belbek repeatedly until Russia is able to sort out its radar issue is on the menu. And the SBU did just that on December 20th, take out a pair of fighter jets that Russia uses both defensively and to launch combat operations against Ukraine. The SBU took to Telegram to announce its successful operation, stating, "Long-range drones of the SBU's Alpha Special Operations Center hit 2 Su-27 aircraft at the Russian Belbek military airfield in temporarily occupied Crimea." The SBU added that one of those Su-27s was on the Belbek taxiway with a full combat load, suggesting that it was preparing to take off for a combat operation. The second jet's location isn't mentioned, so it's unclear if that aircraft was in a hangar or had been left out in the open at the airfield. It doesn't matter, both Su-27s are now flaming wrecks due to SBU drones. The SBU capped off its Telegram post with an explanation of why this particular base was targeted, along with a warning suggesting that more of Ukraine's drones will be paying visits to Crimea sooner rather than later. SBU's strikes on key military airfields, as well as the destruction of enemy aircraft and air defense systems in temporarily occupied Crimea, significantly reduce its military potential in the region. This systematic work will continue in the future, the SBU said. Don't underestimate the importance of Ukraine taking out these two jets. Though they're among the oldest in Russia's air force, Su-27s are still in heavy use, and they've caused plenty of problems for Ukraine in the past. Defense Blog notes that Russia still uses these jets in patrols over Crimea and the Black Sea, as well as for defensive operations in Crimea and the southern parts of Russia that Ukraine has been increasingly targeting with its long-range missiles and drones. Plus, as Army Recognition notes in its profile of the jet, the Su-27 is also useful as an attacking threat. Beyond a range of air-to-air missiles that the jet's pilots use to destroy incoming drones and missiles, assuming they can score hits, an Su-27 is capable of carrying heavy bombs weighing between 100 and 500 kilograms, or 220 and 1,102 pounds. Although these particular jets operate from Crimea, meaning they're unlikely to conduct traditional bombing runs that involve flying directly over Ukrainian targets, that still doesn't mean they don't present an attacking threat. Why? 2 words: glide bombs. Made by converting a standard dumb bomb into a semi-precise long-range weapon by way of a wing kit, glide bombs are heavy, powerful, and they've been shattering Ukraine's cities and infrastructure since at least May 2024. That's when the BBC reported on Russia's increasing use of these powerful bombs in an article in which it pointed out that kits used to make the bombs cost just $20,000 to $30,000 to build. That's not all. The dumb bombs that Russia has been converting into these terrifying aerial threats are the types of bombs that can be loaded into the Su-27. The outlet highlights the Fab 500, which is a 500-kilogram bomb that contains around 200 kilograms of explosive. The Su-27 can carry this type of bomb, and there's a good chance that Russia has been sending its Su-27s from Belbek Air Base into Black Sea airspace to launch these types of bombs at Ukraine. This combination of offensive and defensive utility means that the Su-27 is far from useless. A Soviet-era aerial platform though it may be, the jet has become one of the most commonly used in Russia's arsenal, so taking out any examples of it equals a massive result for Ukraine. Taking out 2 is even better. And that's not just because 2 downed Su-27s lower Russia's Crimean defenses and its attacking potential. As 112.ua reveals, there's a hefty price tag attached to Russia's most recent losses in Crimea, a $70 million price tag to be exact. And that's money that Russia doesn't want to lose when it stands on the brink of an economic collapse. You can find out more about Russia's many money woes in our video. which explains why Russia may not even survive the winter from an economic standpoint. With debt exploding and recession practically in force, any unexpected expenditure is unwelcome for Russia. That's especially the case when it involves older aerial platforms, such as the Su-27. As BBC News Russia explained in November, Russia is struggling to build homegrown commercial planes, in large part due to Western sanctions, making it harder to purchase the parts needed to build them. That sanctions struggle extends to Russia's military aviation sector, and even if it didn't, the Su-27 is such an old airframe that Russia isn't building it anymore and may have a very hard time finding replacement parts for repairs, assuming the jets that Ukraine just destroyed are even capable of being repaired. This was a costly loss for Russia. If Putin wants to replace these Su-27s, he may have to do so potentially by redeploying more modern and more expensive airframes to a base that Ukraine has already proven is exceptionally vulnerable to repeat drone strikes. Taking out a pair of Su-27s wasn't enough for Ukraine. As United 24 Media says in its report on Russia's latest Crimean catastrophe, SBU drones also scored direct hits on a control tower at the Belbek airbase. That's bad news for any other aircraft that are stationed at the base. Control towers are vital for ensuring that aircraft can conduct their flight operations, so the loss of one of those towers may mean that other Russian jets get grounded temporarily to go along with the two Su-27s that Ukraine just took out of commission. Russia will be stinging from this loss, not least because it also lost another airframe from the Belbek base just a few days ago. We mentioned earlier that this SBU strike on Belbek is the second in a matter of days. The first strike occurred on December 18th, and it was extremely effective. The SBU explains how in its Telegram post. On December 18th, the service's drones struck hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Russian equipment at this airport. 2 Nebo SVU radars, a 92N6 radar from the S-400 Triumph air defense system, a Pantsir S-2 air defense system, and a MiG-31 aircraft with full ammunition. That's a pretty big list of targets, and it shows us how Ukraine managed to take out the two Su-27s it just destroyed days after this strike. Ukraine destroyed the radars and a Pantsir S-2 first to limit the base's air defenses. The loss of the MiG-31 was also important, as Russia has been using these jets in an air defense capacity. Belbek is basically an open target for Ukraine now, and Russia will be well advised to remove any other valuable assets stored there sooner rather than later. If it doesn't, Ukraine may well strike again, and again, and again, until everything at Belbek is in flames. What's been happening at Belbek is just one example of a much wider Crimean campaign that has seen the peninsula transform from one of the most important pieces of territory that Putin has stolen from Ukraine into a clear target for Ukraine's long-range drones and missiles. What the SBU showed us on December 20th is that Crimea is still very much a priority for Ukraine, and it's strikes like this that are helping to slowly sever the grip that Putin has had on the peninsula for over a decade. Back in May 2024, Le Monde noted that Crimea was one of Ukraine's top priorities, now that the war had reached a point where Ukraine was just as capable of going on the offense as it was at defending itself against Russia's many assaults. Missiles and drones traveling into the skies over Crimea had become an almost nightly occurrence by that point, the outlet claimed, and there was a big reason why. At the time, Ukraine was awaiting the arrival of the first F-16s that had been promised to it by its Western partners. It would take a few more months for those Western airframes to arrive in Ukraine, with the first being delivered in August 2024, but Le Monde suggested that Ukraine was looking to soften up Russia's Crimea defenses in anticipation of their arrival. Though we now know that Ukraine hasn't been using its F-16s and other fighter jets in Crimea, likely because flying over the Black Sea creates the risk of them being shot down, there were other reasons, even in 2024, that Ukraine kept on targeting the peninsula. Crimea also remains an important logistical hub for supplying the Russian army on the southern front, Le Monde said. Rail convoys continue to pass over the Kerch Bridge, even though damages to the structure in 2022 and 23 have made it necessary to limit the tonnage transported. Numerous shuttles cross the Sea of Azov to the peninsula's east coast to supply Moscow's troops. Think back to the SBU comments that we shared earlier. The organization, along with the others that strike Crimea, always make it a point to state that they're doing so to degrade the Kremlin's war machine. This is what they mean. A peninsula that is as much a logistics hub as an attacking threat to Ukraine needs to be hit hard and often to disrupt Russia's military operations in the deep rear. In more recent months, with peace negotiations now taking place, Ukraine's Crimean campaign takes on a new dimension. That's according to GSI, which points out anything that Ukraine can do to loosen Putin's grip on Crimea is good from the standpoint of gaining leverage. Though Russia continues to try to push deeper into Donetsk, which Putin has been using as leverage of his own, the reality is that the front lines change at such a snail's pace that that Ukraine has the ability to focus resources on the Crimean peninsula. When Putin argues that Ukraine is losing territory in Donetsk, Ukraine can point out that Putin's forces are struggling to do anything of note in Crimea. There's also a financial aspect, as GSI notes. The more Ukrainian drones and missiles that strike Crimea, the fewer Russian tourists visit the peninsula. Russia claimed that between 6 and 8 million tourists were heading to Crimea per year back in 2021. Though those figures are disputed, with Promote Ukraine claiming that they refer to passenger traffic rather than tourist numbers, the point still stands that potentially millions of Russians are now avoiding Crimea due to Ukraine. Fewer tourists results in less money being spent. And we've already touched on why Russia needs to get its hands on as much money as it can from as many sources as are available to it, given the country's economic woes. There's also the territorial aspect of Crimea to consider when we ask why the peninsula is a priority for Ukraine. The fact still remains that Russia illegally annexed Crimea in 2014 and that the territory actually belongs to Ukraine. Operations like the ones that the SBU are launching against bases like Belbek are as much about proving the importance of territorial integrity as they are actually trying to reclaim Crimea. The result is that Ukraine isn't going to be able to use drones and missiles alone to push Russia out of the peninsula. But that isn't the point. To do nothing at all could be taken as a sign that Ukraine is willing to give up this portion of its sovereign territory, which would again hand leverage to Putin. The BBC noted in May that US President Donald Trump has already raised questions over Ukraine's seriousness in the Crimea arena, as he once asked if Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky wants Crimea. Why didn't they fight for it 11 years ago when it was handed over to Russia without a shot being fired? Of course, this statement seems to lack understanding of the nuance of Ukraine's situation at the time, as the country was nowhere near strong enough to respond to Russia's 2014 campaign of aggression with the sorts of responses we've seen to the 2022 invasion. Still, even if Zelensky were potentially willing to hand over Crimea as a part of a peace deal, which he categorically isn't, he wouldn't be able to. As the BBC points out, Article 2 of Ukraine's constitution states that Ukraine's sovereignty extends throughout its entire territory, and that territory within its present border is indivisible and inviolable. In short, Zelensky, even as Ukraine's president, isn't legally able to sign off on ceding Crimea to Russia. Not that he would. However, this fact is one of the reasons why Ukraine has made Crimea a priority. Its very constitution says that the peninsula is part of Ukraine and must be defended as such. In a sense, Ukraine isn't really attacking Crimea, it's defending the peninsula against an occupier that spent a decade building up defenses on the Ukrainian land. And it's doing a very good job of destroying assets that Putin once believed would be safe from any Ukrainian strikes. How wrong Putin was. And Putin's underestimation of his foe means that Crimea has become something that we mentioned during the introduction to this video, a liability. Russia has invested heavily in transforming Crimea into the Russian territory that Putin claims it to be. Crimea was losing money for Russia even before Putin launched his full-scale invasion. In May 2021, Al Jazeera revealed that the Kremlin had poured tens of millions of dollars into Russifying the peninsula, with $3.7 billion of that money having been spent on the Kerch Bridge that links Crimea to mainland Russia. Hospitals, highways, transmission lines, and power plants were all built as part of this investment. Furthermore, the sanctions placed against Russian corporations in response to the Crimea annexation had cost those businesses tens of billions of dollars. Add all of this work to the cost of the military hardware that Putin shipped into Crimea, both before his invasion and what he's had to send since due to Ukraine destroying so much equipment on the peninsula. The $70 million Russia lost due to the SBU destroying a pair of Su-27s is just the tip of a massive iceberg. The Belbek strike that occurred on December 18th is believed to have cost Russia hundreds of millions of dollars. And these are just 2 attacks on Crimea's military infrastructure out of dozens, perhaps even hundreds. Russia has clearly lost billions of dollars in military hardware, in addition to the tourism losses and whatever money has disappeared because Russia can't treat Crimea as its own territory when Ukraine's missiles and drones are flying. It's gotten to the point that a piece of land that was supposed to be one of Russia's greatest strengths has devolved into a massive weakness for Putin. Sticking with the subject of Russia being forced to transform military equipment to the Crimean Peninsula, this was happening as far back as June 2024. That's when Defense Express reported that Russia was scrambling to defend Crimea in the wake of a flurry of Ukrainian strikes that had exposed the peninsula's defenses as being nowhere near fit for purpose. Those June 2024 strikes cast the die for what has become Ukraine's strategy in Crimea ever since. The series of attacks destroyed key elements such as radars used by Russia's S-300 and S-400 air defense systems, which cleared the way for more strikes against other infrastructure. That's precisely what we've seen at Belbek. take out the radars first and then hit the jets. These types of strikes place Putin in a catch-22 situation, as Defense Express explains. While it's likely that Russia can replace systems quickly, continued attrition will likely force Russia to draw on equipment from other areas, as it's done previously. It wishes to maintain its density of air defense coverage, the outlet says. Alternatively, Russia may be forced to accept a reduction in capability, placing its forces on Crimea at increased risk. Allow Crimea to be weakened or draw from the defenses in other areas to keep Crimea ticking along. Putin has chosen the latter in most cases, not least because he knows how important it is for Russia to maintain its hold on Crimea for leverage in peace negotiations. But Ukraine just keeps on chipping away. Now, replacing systems quickly isn't as much of a possibility for Russia. If it were, the Belbek base would have been prepared for a follow-up strike due to Russia switching out destroyed radars with working ones. Russia didn't do that. 2 of its Su-27s are now out of commission. New Eastern Europe expands on this, noting that Ukraine hasn't just seen success on the Crimean mainland. Its drones and missiles have taken out 33% of the Black Sea fleet that once used Crimea as its hub. The remainder of Russia's ships have since withdrawn, weakening Russia's military presence in Crimea even further, and allowing Ukraine to focus more of its efforts on hitting land-based targets, rather than those at sea that Putin thought would cause his opponents so much trouble earlier in the war. Crimea is also a liability from the perspective of Putin's attempts to capture more territory on the Ukrainian mainland. New Eastern Europe says that up to 160,000 Russian soldiers are stationed on the peninsula rather than fighting in Ukraine. They have to be, as with the air defenses and other military hardware, Putin has to spend big on resources like soldiers to ensure Crimea is defended from Ukrainian attacks. That's billions of dollars being spent on a force that contributes little to nothing to Russia's main goal of taking over Ukraine. What was intended as a base for southern operations has become a resource-draining defensive commitment that contributes little to Russian offensive capabilities. And that sums up Russia's Crimea conundrum in a nutshell. Putin can't afford to defend Crimea, but he also can't afford to lose it. Ukraine is taking advantage of that by a death by 1,000 cuts strategy, through which it uses Crimea to whittle away at the Russian war machine. On December 12th, it was 2 Su-27s. In future strikes, it may be more jets, radars, air defense systems, or even troops that go down under the power of Ukraine's drones. And don't forget what has already happened. We've mentioned the SBU's December 18th attack on Belbek several times already, and it was a big one. If you'd like to find out more about this attack and our prediction that it would lead to a second strike in short order, then check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Ukraine's campaign in Crimea. And thank you as always for watching.